Let's talk about Putin, because, more precisely, about Putin's death. Russian dictator Vladimir Putin has been repeatedly tried to be killed. The head of the intelligence of Ukraine, Kirillo Budanov, said this in an interview with NWX. At the same time, he compared Putin, the prospect of Putin's death, to the death of Joseph Stalin. At the time, people thought that their whole world had collapsed and it was unclear how to live on. Given that Putin has been in power for more than 20 years, do you think it will be a similar feeling? Do Russians really have a fear of losing their ruler now, because he is the guarantor of their stability? Do they think?
Look what an amazing, bizarre smile of history. Stalin was born in 1879, that is, roughly speaking, in March 53, March 5th, when he died, having previously lain in a puddle for almost 2 days, is a well-known story. Well, it turns out, he was 74 years old, he was somewhere like that, a little less, 73. Putin is close to this milestone, Putin is 72. But Stalin had a withered hand, loved Georgian wine, drank, smoked, and piped. Herzegovina Flora smoked such cigarettes. Herzegovina Flora was brought to him by plane. He crumbled this tobacco into a pipe, smoked a pipe. He had pulmonary emphysema, very severe, because of smoking all his life. Weak heart. A lot of bad habits. He didn't sleep well. They say that he worked at night. This was not only because he liked it, but because he simply could not sleep. He had insomnia. He slept in the morning, so all the meeting, all the work took place at night. All the people's commissars gathered for a meeting with Stalin, military commanders only at night, the generals, and so on. Putin differs better from Stalin in terms of such acquired diseases. He never smoked, he did not abuse alcohol. Now he has not been drinking at all for many years, this is known. He takes care of his health, swims, massages, all sorts of rejuvenating procedures. Well, what can I say? They didn't even tell us. And, what does he have?
Putin has shamans.
Oh, no, well, shamans are, yes, he does, but it's more for some kind of psychological calm, so to speak, faith in all these occult magical rites that help him rejuvenate. Well, that's SOSO. No, there is a real physical impact on him, some kind of pharmaceutical support. This is medical work with him. That is, it maintains his health in the right condition. But nevertheless, he is also a usurper and dictator, comparable to Stalin. This is a fact, even at least in terms of the degree of his self-isolation. Look, it is so high, the same as Stalin's. Stalin, by the way, for example, had never been to the front. Unlike Hitler. Hitler often did not get out of the front line. And Stalin was generally very confined in a narrow space, the Kuntsevo dacha, the near dacha, the far dacha, and, in fact, the Kremlin. And in the study where he often slept he had his own room, furnished to his liking, by the care of a secretary to ensure his safety. In order not to travel a lot, I was afraid. That is, there were fears. Putin also stands out for his danger of being the target of assassination attempts and influences, so he is very isolated. Hence the guards, whom he raises to the level of governors and ministers. He has a security guard from the Ministry of Emergency Situations, for example, the well-known Dayuman, who was the governor of the Tula region before his appointment to the state councils, his right hand, so to speak. And can Putin be threatened with this, you know, like Krustaliev's, a Khan known as Beria? When Comrade Stalin was resting and suffered a stroke, blood was already flooding, blood vessels were bursting. Well, there were cholesterol accumulations, plaques in the vessels. And, in principle, there was not much that could be done. The man was not young, medicine was at a different level, but it was still possible to take some measures. It's possible, but I want to emphasize that the chances of him having a sudden stroke, such as a stroke or heart attack, are very, very small. He still takes care of his body, even if it is worn out, and of its protection, and of his immediate environment. Yuri Kovalchuk, by the way, oversees these issues. It is impossible to imagine that such an instantaneous event would happen, and that he would simply be left lying in a puddle, even if someone would really like him to leave as soon as possible. It does not look realistic. Why? Because we can't judge, it's a closed system. But I am deeply convinced that Putin drew conclusions from Stalin's death, among other things. He drew these conclusions, you see. Ironically, Putin draws lessons from previous periods, especially the 20th century, from the way leaders completed their journeys. And he wants to protect himself as much as possible, to hedge these risks. Hence, it is no coincidence that he is preparing a transformation into a dynastic regime of this totalitarian system, so that his legacy will go to his children, grandchildren or closest associates. As I joke, he will take and give both of his daughters in marriage to Dayuman, making them his very close wives. But it doesn't matter. The meaning and the essence is that he drew conclusions about how not to act. And it seems to me that this whole gigantic service machine that Putin has, in your case, is designed for the natural process of eliminating him in case of an illness in which no one will help him. Probably, they expect that he will leave faster than the horses. As we say, it is unlikely that something like this will happen. That is, history does not repeat itself twice. And it is quite possible to imagine poisoning or some kind of influence from third parties. This cannot be ruled out, it is always possible. He is trying to protect himself from this, but with the modern development of means for remote destruction, poisons and other things, I would not rule out such a possibility at all, you know, I would not exclude it at all. When injuries are caused, whether mechanical or unnatural, which will cause natural, medical and other consequences, it will generally lead to death. I can quite imagine this, because it probably remains an open question, are there people in his environment who are ready and willing to carry out such actions? Nothing can be ruled out, because the courtyard is closed, the so-called Russian courtyard, isolated from view. We don't know much, very little information leaks out, and we only judge by the individual pieces of information that are accumulating, mainly thanks to Western intelligence. Yes, Western intelligence services themselves pass this information on to experts for discussion and analysis. A lot of information comes from the leaks of Western intelligence services, which intercept telephone conversations, check or analyze emails. All these toys belong to Americans, the servers are in America, so they just listen to everyone. I think that sometimes, when we see articles in Western publications or expert comments under the guise of articles, it is mainly a reflection of the information that the American intelligence services have. This is my opinion.
We have talked about Putin's alleged death, but we can state 2 deaths in the following context. 2 people died in Russia in 2 days. A businessman and a civil servant associated with the former deputy of former Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, Timur Ivanov, who was arrested in April for bribery conspiracy. What are these mysterious deaths?
Тимуром Івановим, якого у квітні заарештували у справі про хабар. Що це за загадкові смерті?
Obviously, this is not a coincidence, as the two are connected to Timur Ivanov.
You know, the details are unknown. I only caught a glimpse of it in the film. Let's talk about it in general. Does it happen that some figures, some undesirable figures or witnesses are eliminated in this way in Russia? Yes, the answer is yes. We have seen this, and not only in Russia, but also abroad. Someone may say that we do not have evidence, but we are not looking for it, because we are not an investigative or operational service engaged in the search for accurate evidence. They may become known to the public in other ways, but the fact is that Russia has never used such methods, or we have not seen assassination attempts or even assassinations by various means disguised as natural causes of death. Nevertheless, it happened in the UK, we know it. With Krepel, with Litvinenko. other, less well-known cases, but just as successful and unsuccessful attempts. And in Russia, it's a whole sport. But, of course, such things cannot do without special services. As for Timur Ivanov and Shoigu, you understand, this is a huge amount of money. In addition to state interests, it is also a question of gigantic sums of money, of enormous size and scale. That is, of course, a person can be removed for less, if you will pardon the expression, but when it comes to billions of dollars, especially in the contracts managed by Timur Ivanov as Shoigu's confidant, these were just huge riches, you see. Therefore, murder is not something exceptional here. Someone could be intimidated to identify Kurds from cryptocurrency wallets, or simply poisoned to prevent information leakage. At the same time, they could use the murder as a cover to withdraw all the money that he had. Such things happen. Sometimes it happens directly at the Lubyanka stations or even in the Kremlin. Sometimes it is decided by someone on the horizontal, solving their own problems. Life is tough there, you know, fierce competition within the state flow. Very tough. And Timur Ivanov, in particular, became one of the victims when he was brought to justice. And all his confidants, of course, were numerous, because the management of such large sums requires the distribution of responsibilities in different directions. And yes, of course, attempts, which means that this money can be found and killed. There is nothing surprising. I just mean that in addition to state reasons, such as betrayal or discrediting, banal motives like it was yours, it became ours, also play here. It's just a matter of money, and I say, we've seen this before, it's not surprising.
Mark, I will clarify the wire of this message. I will quote the Russian one. In 2 days, businessman Igor Kotelnikov and Defense Ministry official Magom Kandayev mysteriously died in Russia. They are associated with Shoigu's former deputy, Timur Ivanov, who was arrested in April in a bribery case. According to a member of the Russian Presidential Human Rights Council, Kotelnikov died after being in the punishment cell of the pretrial detention center, allegedly due to a blood clot rupture. A blood clot. This is an obvious cause, a standard cause of death for the Russian federal service system, which follows specific orders. Mark, on the signing of laws by dictator Putin. Putin signs a law on the biggest tax hike in Russian history, raising nearly 17 trillion rubles over the next 6 years, equivalent to $120 billion. What can the largest tax increase in Russia indicate?
This indicates that there is not enough money, and that it will continue to go. Now, by the way, tax increases in Russia are being vigorously discussed, but I see it in community groups and in chat rooms, especially under videos, where economists and others discuss it. So what? There is nothing surprising here. There is nothing surprising here. The situation is not as benign as Moscow portrays it. They simply pump out free financial resources from the population. This is obvious. You need to finance the war and you also need to steal, you know? And you need to take it, skinning this very population. Could they do without it? But, apparently, not anymore, because before that they did not raise taxes, and taxes are already quite high, in some cases even extortionate, since many evade paying them. The tax scale is quite strict, but if desired, they can be increased to the maximum. We see that they are experimenting with peripheral methods, including bloggers, to identify underpayments. Raising taxes is a natural process in a wartime, as Ukraine receives assistance from allies, while Moscow does not have such capabilities, which leads to the need to rob the population. This money is not spent on the construction of schools, roads, hospitals. This is an important concept. This is money for the war, for the continuation of the war. This is the most important conclusion from this whole story. And I believe that yes, taxes will be raised, and new taxes will be introduced in general. They have long dreamed of introducing many new taxes related to childlessness and other measures similar to those that existed in Soviet times. This is possible. This is possible, and this process, it will go with acceleration, depending on how much the war consumes. Let me remind you that the military budget has grown enormously, from about 2.5% to 8%, that is, almost 3 times. Well, this is really a lot, because the war costs a lot of money, and the longer it lasts, the less money remains, which is also obvious. Resource sources are running out. So, by and large, they are going down this path and are probably implementing this tax innovation. By the way, Ms. Huston, a major defendant, was previously the head of the tax service, now the Prime Minister for the second time. There was a big supporter of raising taxes, by the way. Few people know. Always insisted on it. That's the way it is.
Mark, Putin continues to be praised, even though he is collecting money from the Russian population. Not all, but part of the population will continue to hate Putin. Putin is frightened by provocations. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said that Ukraine is allegedly preparing to destroy the dams of the Kiev hydroelectric power station in the Kharkiv reservoir to blame Russia. In order to be able to take such statements seriously, we, Mark, would probably need to drink as much alcohol as the drunken Zakharova. What kind of blackmail and intimidation is this? And can the Russians really be preparing for this?
Firstly, they have already attacked the dam once, not to mention other critical infrastructure facilities, the energy infrastructure of Ukraine. The only thing that they, in my opinion, only bypassed was power reactors, nuclear power plants. There are, I think, about 15 of them in Ukraine. And everything else, in my opinion, everything that was not attacked, and without any provocations, was simply taken and fired missiles at these targets. So from the point of view of why should the Ukrainians invent some provocations, if these are already targets for Russian strikes on the territory of Ukraine? It's logical, you know? Well, I kind of think I'm going from formal logic. I can hardly imagine how Zakharova thinks. It seems that she has a flickering consciousness in this sense. But on the other hand, if we try to find a rational explanation for this, it seems to me that all the recent statements after the strikes on Omedit and Kiev, when the Ministry of Defense dryly stated that it was none of their business, speak for themselves. Without any explanations, and so on. This is an anti-missile, he says, Ukrainian, and that's it, although the facts indicate the opposite. In my opinion, they are already preparing in advance for new strikes, using information support in the form of statements that it is Ukraine that is shelling itself, that the explosions are due to provocations. This is unconvincing, it does not convince anyone, but they do their job in this sense. For Zakharova, lying and inventing is not new at all. Can we conclude from this that they are preparing to strike at this dam and other objects of this kind? It is difficult to imagine that this would not become their goal, which may be inaccessible to Russia. Well, power reactors at nuclear power plants are already an extreme case, because it can backfire. God knows what this can lead to, so there are some containment mechanisms at work here. In general, I do not know of a single industry facility, be it civilian, military or energy infrastructure, that would not be attacked at all. From shopping centers to substations, from power units of various plants producing heat and electricity, to children's hospitals. What objects were not on this list for another 2.5 years of the war? It is therefore part of the propaganda, the part of communication which is always necessary to explain the current aims and means of war. Therefore, to be honest, I would not attach any importance to Zakharova at all about what she says. Well, if we talk about a far-reaching conclusion, then the only thing that can be said is that, as Orban said, the next 2 or 3 months will be very tense. Probably, they are trying to justify such intentions, such statements.
Mark, what is obvious is that Russia, the terrorist country, does not have the means and capabilities to destroy the dams near Kiev and Kharkiv. Because it is impossible to destroy these facilities with missile strikes, and the option of sabotage is excluded, because the dams are under heavy security, so what they are trying to do there is indeed possible. You may also recall that in May, a month before the peace summit in Switzerland, Russia launched an offensive in the Kharkiv region and tried to scare everyone by saying that it had enough forces to continue occupying new territories of Ukraine and opening new fronts. Thus, the Russians may be trying to pressure Ukraine to agree to their terms, or not. And we remember that in July, before the NATO anniversary summit, Russia launched a terrorist missile attack on Ukraine and prioritizes the destruction of civilian targets, as you mentioned, the attack on the Okhmatyk Children's Hospital in Kiev. Again, the position is traced, negotiate, or we will continue to kill you. Ultimate methods.
Well, I think yes, different experts may differ in their assessments, but most agree that the intensification of strikes and the selection of new facilities such as children's hospitals is a new phenomenon. Not the only one, not the last. There will be something else just as sensitive. Well, I don't know, a kindergarten, something else. This, in general, indicates the choice of means and methods of pressure on Ukraine. Well, not only to Ukraine. Why? Because it is very difficult to put pressure on the Ukrainians. They saw everything. People were dying at the fronts, loved ones, relatives and so on. And Ukrainian society, despite the exhaustion from the war, is still not ready to give in to the ultimatum pressure and accept Putin's plan and its consequences. But it can impress the West. This may be impressive, because observers in the West, even if they are not directly involved, believe that they are dealing with unstable personalities and suggest considering some kind of ceasefire to avoid such situations. Because we see children's hospitals being destroyed, but we can't do anything about it. For us, it is even more painful somehow, from the point of view of observation from the outside. And it seems to me that the main message, the main signal still comes from Moscow towards the West. We really won't stop until we achieve our goals. Now we benefit from a temporary ceasefire, provided that it leads to negotiations and a subsequent peaceful resolution of the conflict, taking into account our preconditions voiced by Putin. There are 3 of them. This involves the transfer of control over 4 regions to their administrative borders, namely Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia, with the withdrawal of Ukrainian armed forces from the unoccupied parts of these regions. In return, it was proposed to lift all sanctions and grant Ukraine the status of neutrality, which means a ban on joining NATO. These are prerequisites. One can imagine what the conditions will be. Yes, this is really a means of pressure, such an escalation. It emphasizes that we are ready to go to the end, leaving nothing out of brackets. It is important to get Ukraine to accept these conditions so that it agrees to a ceasefire and negotiations, aware of the threat to child care facilities. Well, we will do this. We are not afraid of anything, so it is easier to negotiate with us than to leave everything as it is. And to be honest, I don't see any other signal here. It seems to me that it is unequivocal and straightforward, because any attempt to interpret it differently, be it as a unilateral breakdown of intentions at the Swiss summit, in Orban's mission, or during consultations and negotiations, looks unconvincing. And this is despite any attempts to reach agreements. Moscow has always accompanied this escalation of hostilities. Let me remind you that in March 2022, negotiations were held in Istanbul, which were interrupted due to hostilities. Moscow refused to compromise on Kiev's proposal to temporarily cease fire during the negotiations. They say, no, we will continue to do this. For them, the situation has not changed by and large. Before the start of real negotiations, they will escalate actions, and after a possible ceasefire, they may agree to concessions to a certain extent. They seek to create the impression both in the West and in Ukraine that the terrible consequences of the strikes and destruction can only be compensated or replaced by a full and immediate ceasefire, followed by bilateral negotiations.
прекращение огня двустороннее, при котором, да, при прекращенном огне должны начаться немедленные переговоры.
Because, you know, today he ceased fire. If not in your opinion, you took something, resumed it again. What obligation does this entail? If the ceasefire had been unconditional, they would have ceased fire, and that's it. And whether there will be negotiations or not is a big question. And secondly, look how effective a ceasefire can be, which even Ukraine might agree to accept. Front lines, let's leave them alone, people are shooting there, that's understandable. But let's stop shelling each other's mutual territory. Ukrainian territory will stop being bombed with Kinzhals, all these Sarmats, aerial bombs and drones. And Ukraine will do it. But Moscow will never do this, you know? And Moscow sees its advantage in this, the ability to remotely destroy targets on the territory of Ukraine, chosen arbitrarily throughout its territory, which is inaccessible to Ukraine. If Ukraine bombed the Kremlin's Spassky Tower every day, surely it would make them think seriously. They said, no, let's really stop. And when there is a population in Belgorod or somewhere else, what difference does it make to them? The Kremlin does not care about this at all. Therefore, they do not agree to such ceasefire conditions. Stop touching the territory outside the front line. What does this mean? Moscow, any ceasefire, any intermediate agreement, any such benefit, in order to derive maximum benefit.
Понимаете, так, чтобы извлечь из этого максимальную выгоду. Вот. А не то, чтобы это был какой-то компромисс, приемлемый двумя сторонами.
Марк, я вам дуже дякую за те, що ви долучилися до прямого ефіру. Дякую
Mark,
за
for those who have reached the straight efera. Dyakuzie vashi tsikavi for hovi dunki. Friends, do not forget to write on Mark Feigin's YouTube channel, FEYGІN Live.
President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky criticized Indian Prime Minister Modi for a warm meeting with Putin on the day of the massive shelling of Ukraine. This is a huge disappointment and a crushing blow to the peace effort to see the leader of the world's largest democracy embrace Modi, the world's bloodiest criminal, on a day like this, the president wrote. But at the same time, we saw this footage, we saw how Modi calls Putin his friend. Well, is it that cheap oil doesn't smell like blood?
Well, you know, I lived in India for more than 3 years, and I know this country well. Unfortunately, India's foreign policy has always been as selfish as possible. But especially with the rise to power of Modi and his alliance with the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, a nationalist party. This is what they are discussing in various international forums on a wide variety of global issues, from various wars and conflicts to climate and so on, before international trade. That is, they do everything exclusively as it is beneficial to them. This, of course, is very bad. We need to talk about this seriously, and including calls for the Indian opposition to be more involved in defending international democratic values, because it really looked disgusting. How Modi hugged and smiled with him against the backdrop of all this ongoing terrorist act. But, you know, it's not just bad news. In general, it is interesting to look at Putin's latest international meetings and visits. Notice how amazingly empty they are. That is, he and Modi did not agree on anything about oil. Oil is supplied to India at huge discounts. Modi is terribly dissatisfied with a large number of things. For example, that we have an imbalance in trade. Russia exports a lot of oil, but does not buy Indian goods. The Indians are trying to solve this issue, but this issue is not being resolved. In general, because of them, because their rupee is not a convenient currency for international settlements. Further, their key problem is that military technical cooperation has actually collapsed. India has traditionally been the largest buyer of Russian weapons. But it is clear that because of the war, Putin needs these weapons. Or, at least, he needs the capacity of military factories in order to supply all this to the front. And Russia began to delay the delivery of the S-400, deepened the situation, and a lot is still happening. We see that India has begun to turn very actively towards the West in terms of arms supplies. And even, perhaps, their joint production with Western companies in India. So such a very gloomy background. Calculations do not work, cooperation on the export of Russian weapons is declining. India is dissatisfied. I wonder if there was anything noticeable in terms of the composition of the delegations at today's meeting? Obviously, only oil and weapons were discussed there, because there are no other issues on the agenda. So the bad news is that, of course, all these hugs from Modi at such a tragic moment look disgusting. But the good news is that no matter how much they hug, there is no content there. As with 11 in May, there was none. Putin has not yet been able to activate his entire international anti-Western coalition. There are a lot of hugs, but little content.
By the way, according to information from Bloomberg, Russia and India plan to reach agreements on the supply of uranium for a new nuclear power plant, but are also discussing issues of monetary settlements after Russia is disconnected from the SWIFT banking system, which requires a change in approach to cooperation. Did you really discuss these questions?
I am sure that now, given the US sanctions on uranium, Russia will actively look for other markets around the world, but they will not find a comparable market for the sale of uranium. Because 2/3 of the world's nuclear power plants are in the United States, France and Japan. They will not buy Russian uranium one way or another. Therefore, they will be able to accommodate some crumbs here. But you can't expect much from this there. According to the calculations, look, this is an unsolvable situation. It's just that, in principle, it is unsolvable. Why? Because the policy of the Indian authorities is against the active use of the rupee abroad. This is also the reverse side of internal statist egoism. They are very afraid of risks to their own currency if it begins to be actively used in international trade and settlements. Therefore, it does not work. That is, Russian exporters sell something for rupees in India, and these rupees remain there, which makes it difficult to export them. Now they were discussing some kind of scheme, they agreed on the following. As for these rupees, they can be converted into investments in various projects within India. But I have a question. And how, for example, will they earn any profit from these projects? And how will they bring it out? That is, it's still just a temporary postponement of the same problem, but it cannot be fundamentally solved. Because Indians are very cautious about regulating their currency and do not want to release it to world markets, as they believe that this is associated with risks. I repeat, you understand that over the past 30 years, the Russian economy has been focused primarily on trade with Europe and the open world. Because there are significant problems in trade with these countries. Both logistical difficulties and the lack of liquid convenient currencies for settlements. So, despite all the hugs, the problem of settlements with India remains unresolved. There's nothing they can do here.
Also, Putin and Modi allegedly agreed that they would return Indians to India, who are fighting in Ukraine on the side of the Russian Federation. Some have already died, there have been such cases. And again Modi agreed that everyone should be returned. And how did it happen that Indian citizens ended up in a war with Ukraine?
Well, there were a lot of investigations on this topic. They were really lured by deception. That is, they were attracted, perhaps, by some tours or work, but participation in the war, of course, was not implied. They just brought them to the Rostov region to the assembly point, gave them uniforms, weapons and sent them forward. In general, you see, this is one of the trifles, although insignificant in number, as I understand it, but it shows how huge a shortage of personnel they have to complete the army. They are forced to resort to such measures as deceiving the Indians and sending them to the front. The presidents of the two countries are forced to deal with this issue in order to bring everyone back. That is, the operation to deceive the Indians to the front obviously ended in failure. By the way, you can watch it if you want. Today I released a large video on my channel about the many crisis problems in Putin's army and military industry. And this is where the most key problem is, of course, personnel. And such episodes show what hellish tricks Putin has to go to and what scandals with a close friend and ally he then runs into. Simply because they do not have enough people to recruit the army.
Russia's financial isolation can only arise if the world market no longer needs Russian exports. And what other Russian export goods are bought? Probably, after all, oil remains a priority. And is it possible to change this so that the financial isolation of Russia really takes place?
You see, there is an interesting story here. Of course, the overwhelming majority of our exports, about 3/4, traditionally consist of raw materials and goods of primary processing, such as metallurgy, chemistry, and so on. Moreover, when the sanctions came into force, and Russia was forced to reorient itself to Asia, all this trade goes with huge discounts, and logistics became more expensive. That is, it is much more expensive to transport by rail to the east. Transporting everything by tanker to Bombay instead of Genoa or Rotterdam is much more expensive and difficult. That is, export revenues from raw materials have decreased, and costs have increased. But interestingly, no one allows Russian non-commodity and non-energy goods to enter these markets. They are not there. And so many Russian officials have been crying on this topic lately. It was cool. Viewers can find an interview with Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Industry and Trade Yuran. He said that Russia will not be able to establish import substitution for large complex products, such as aircraft, cars, and so on, because there is no access to the foreign market. And the domestic market is too small. And it does not give the scale that is needed to produce airplanes, cars. The country, in general, is poor, and all the friends in the BRICS, neither China, nor India, nor Brazil, nor South Africa, are in no hurry to give Russian non-commodity goods access to their markets. For example, last year, in 2023, non-resource and non-energy exports from Russia collapsed by almost a quarter. That is, for Russia, the situation is such that in addition to raw materials, it cannot and will not be able to produce other competitive products, because the countries of the global south do not open their markets, which is a key condition. The second key condition is that the entire monopoly and corrupt Chevai's economy can create at least some working product. This is also a big problem, because despite promises to replace the fleet of Boeing and Airbus aircraft with Russian models such as Superjets and MS-21s, none of this is being implemented. Everything is postponed due to the fact that a corrupt monopoly system, devoid of consumer orientation, still retains Soviet methods of production. They can't even understand what a competitive product is. Therefore, it will not earn anything, it will not take off, and thus the only export potential is raw materials.
Russia's oil and gas revenues rose about 41% year-on-year in the first half of the year to about $65 billion and are said to be all thanks to rising oil prices and a weaker ruble. And why, for example, do the same strikes on refineries not lead to oil prices collapsing? After all, now the Russian Federation must sell more raw materials. Why then does the price hold?
Well, there are two questions there. The first is about the growth of oil revenues. Do not be too impressed by this figure, because the first half of the year is compared with the first half of last year. When there was the biggest blow from the beginning of the European oil embargo, Russian oil cost $50. Within a year, they managed to somehow reduce the discounts and restore relations. So, now its price is... According to June data from Argus, the Russian export blend Ural cost from $67 to $68 per barrel. This is a lot. That is, they receive a stable cash flow. This is above the price ceiling of the G7, and we need to continue working with this in order to reduce these incomes. But they still lack this money, because data have just been published on 1 trillion rubles of the federal budget deficit for the first half of the year, which, according to the amendments, is expected to exceed 2 trillion for the whole year. This means that at current prices, they still don't fit in, and they need more. Now, what is happening to oil prices? They are affected not so much by the blows to refineries, but, of course, by the actions of OPEC plus the fact that they have reduced production quite significantly in recent years. Otherwise, oil would be somewhere there at 50 or below. I think that we will see this trend in the fall, because in early June, the OPEC plus Committee of Ministers announced a decision that they would begin to withdraw from these quotas in October and increase production. On the other hand, we see that the Chinese economy will not start in any way and will not return to high growth rates. The Eurozone is balancing somewhere on the brink of recession. Only the United States is now showing some good economic growth. Therefore, there is not enough demand. And if OPEC increases production in the fall, then I think that there is every chance that prices will drop. Well, of course, I have just come out of a video call with our European and American colleagues, where we discussed specific measures to improve the efficiency of the price ceiling. You can see that they are seriously working on this problem and imposing sanctions against ships, carriers and traders, including from third countries. I hope that we will also be able to tighten control here.
Another report from Bloomberg. The newspaper writes that Russian oligarchs receive billions of dollars in dividends due to the growth of Russia's military economy. Well, they say that a dozen big businessmen have divided payments of 1 trillion rubles for 2023 and the first quarter of 2024, as their companies resumed or even increased payments in the face of the adaptation of the Russian economy to sanctions from Western countries. Many of these oligarchs are closely linked to Putin, and some have themselves been sanctioned. And how does it happen that they do the opposite? Life is even better during the war.
Look, there is also the magic of headlines here. You need to look carefully at all these figures. In principle, this is last year's news, because there was a lot of discussion about the fact that Russian business received a record consolidated profit last year. I think it was 34 trillion or 36 trillion, I don't remember the exact figure. These dividends, well, it was clear that part of this profit would go to dividends. So, look, there are two good news besides these bad ones. The first is that these profits are excessively concentrated in a very narrow set of industries. That is, these are oil workers, banks, metallurgists, chemists, roughly speaking. That is, 3/4 of all these profits. This is right in several sectors. The rest of the economy is on the verge of break-even at best. Most of the key sectors, such as mechanical engineering, retail, and autopilot transportation, are balancing, all of which are operating with about zero profitability. Therefore, it attracts attention, as several large oligarchic structures show significant profits. Then, the next step is for the state to start raising taxes and taking this profit to the budget. This will help support the budget temporarily, but spending will grow faster, weakening it in the long term. Profit extraction can lead to a reduction in investment and production. And there are all sorts of alarming conversations about the cooling of the economy. This is one of the factors in the desire to take these profits in the form of taxes, which will contribute to this. Well, and the third. Now there is a lot of discussion that yes, the oligarchs have received dividends. You know, this is much better than if they used this profit somewhere for new investments. Most likely, these people will try to withdraw this money from Russia somehow. And this is good. That's good news. Due to very strict currency and export controls, the flow of capital has now decreased. Imagine that you are Oleg Perov. Where do you invest this money in Russia? You, of course, will try to bring them out. Moreover, Oleg Perov can do it. Therefore, it is very good. These dividends are not the part that is guaranteed to remain in Russia and will work for Putin's economy. Most likely, I think that they will try to withdraw a significant part of this amount abroad. This is exactly what is needed now. Less money will remain in Russia.
Russia may face a silent crisis in the economy in the second half of 2024. Since the main drivers of economic growth are the consumption of citizens, capital investment, they will be under threat due to a possible increase in rates by the central bank. And analysts came to this conclusion. They say that they are close to the authorities of the Russian Federation. This is the Center for Macroeconomic Analysis. And what does the concept of a silent crisis include? And can we expect a global crisis?
In general, if you look at the economic situation, it is not so quiet. That is, inflation is the most painful story for absolutely everyone. And for the military-industrial complex, for example, because they have a long interval exam. They receive money for finished products after a long time, when this money has already depreciated significantly due to inflation. Directors of defense enterprises are actively speaking out on this matter, claiming that contracts with them are concluded at 2017 prices, although all costs have increased significantly. So, the first problem is related to inflation, and the second is really that high interest rates kill opportunities for long-term credit and investment in development. For example, the share of financing capital investments through bank loans is only 10%. Most enterprises are forced to finance their investments from their own funds, since they have no other sources of investment. They are cut off from international markets, and loans are prohibitively expensive. The overwhelming majority of businesses do not provide such profitability to repay these loans. Then it begins a chicken and egg. Precisely, this is the so-called self-sustaining feedback effect. When high inflation forces an even higher rate, respectively, an additional rate hike simply closes the topic of affordable loans for businesses. I also made another video on my channel here. I just made a cut not even of the entire forum, but only from one session. At the beginning of July, they held a financial congress of the Bank of Russia in St. Petersburg. Look, they say that there is no private investment and there will be no long-term money. At the same time, they do not know how to act, since a reduction in the interest rate will lead to an additional inflationary explosion and, in general, a disaster. Thus, in their own words, a stalemate arose. Therefore, the CMAC, the Center for Macroeconomic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting, is indeed the leading macroeconomic center of the government. It was created by Andrei Belousov, who now holds the post of Minister of Defense. For months now, they have been discussing that rapid GDP growth due to investment in the military sphere has its limits. Then everything freezes. That is, a high rate freezes the availability of loans. Inflation in general is a big threat to economic activity. Further, import payments are frozen. Russia cannot produce a lot of equipment and components for production, which most are imported, and so on. Therefore, yes, of course, they are right. The only question is that it has stretched out a little in time, but we see how in the coming months all these effects will inevitably come.
Well, by the way, Nabialina herself, she named 3 restrictions on the Russian economy. The shortage of labor, restrictions on access to technology and lack of investment also have an effect. She says that we can no longer grow. Growth can only be due to labor productivity, and labor productivity is technology. And how can you decipher her statement that robots will continue to work?
There is a lot of demagogy in everything they say, because this is not supported by any real, noticeable technological breakthroughs. Gref had a very interesting presentation last month at another St. Petersburg Economic Forum. It was a big event, where Putin was also present, and they discussed a lot. Gref showed a graph of economic difficulty in Russia, which I also showed in my videos. This graph shows that the role of high technology in manufacturing in Russia has has not changed over the past 15 years, it has not grown. The economy remains as primitive as it was. Because innovation and technological development do not germinate in the absence of property rights. In conditions when your investors and creatives are imprisoned by the FSB, when you have draconian capital and currency controls, you need to ask permission for everything. In general, such a simple thing, in my opinion, is obvious to everyone. No complex technological products can be created without international cooperation. And Russia ruined this whole thing with this isolation. And now he is trying to urgently attach something incomprehensible to the superjet instead of the French engine, which, as we can see, does not fly. And, by the way, once again, this cooperation worked with the West. That is, the same superjet is an aircraft that was stuffed with the most Western components and technologies. And China does not want to see us in this capacity. Russia was excluded from the joint project of the CR-929, a Russian-Chinese wide-body aircraft. Now the project is called CI-929, while the letter P is no longer used. Russia may supply individual components for this project, but it may not participate at all. Therefore, there will be no technology without the West. There will be no investment without the West. Well, about the challenge in terms of labor resources, this is an unsolvable problem for them now. It is clear that in Russia there are fewer labor resources than the economy needs, plus Putin for the war. That is, here the supply of labor resources lags significantly behind the demand, and this problem is not solved in any way. As Deputy Prime Minister Chernyshenko said at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, the birth rate will not increase by government decree.
Yes, Rosstat said that mortality in Russia exceeds the birth rate, which indicates an unstable demographic situation in the future. Indeed, Putin may have problems with personnel for the armed forces of the Russian Federation, as there is an increase in the number of contract soldiers with high salaries. This raises questions about where this money comes from, what you can save on, and how long it will last.
Откуда они берут эти деньги, на чем они могут сэкономить, ну и как долго их еще хватит?
Yes, I heard that Russia adopted a package of tax increases from January 1st, including a significant increase in regional taxes, such as income tax and personal income tax, which are largely directed to regional budgets. These additional payments when concluding contracts for military service are now taken over by the regions. However, the regions do not have enough of these funds, and they are increasingly forced to turn to the debt market. This change in tax legislation is due to an attempt to ensure that the regions have sufficient funding for such military payments, but with these costs growing fantastically every month, the situation becomes more complicated.
На все вот эти вот военные выплаты, но с таким фантастическим ростом вот самих этих выплат, вы видите, да, что они каждый месяц.
And these are already such very impressive amounts.
Очень внушительные суммы.
We see 1,300,000, 1,600,000. Multiply by 10,000 people recruited under a contract in some region, and you get very impressive amounts.
И вы получаете очень внушительные суммы,
Therefore, this problem will grow.
она будет нарастать.
And in other areas. Here I explained this in a fresh video on my channel. They also lack money in other areas. There is not enough money for the military-industrial complex, because Chemizov says that they have zero profitability. There is a shortage of money for supplies, and there are reports that soldiers are forced to earn a living on their own, and the army is working as a guerrilla unit, providing for itself. This is being said from absolutely official tribunes. I think that in the near future they will be forced to significantly increase the military budget by several trillion rubles if Putin does not decide to stop the war. We will find out at the end of August or in September, when the draft new budget for next year will be presented.
Russia has said it intends to continue supplying gas to Europe through Ukraine after the current contract expires. Novak confirmed this and pointed out that the decision depends on Ukraine, despite the position of President Zelensky about his unwillingness to extend the gas contract with Russia. Why does Russia insist on using the Ukrainian GTS, and what will it lose if the contract is not extended?
The shortest way. Who is the recipient? Hungary and Slovakia, first of all, and Austria. This is the main cluster that continues to buy Russian gas in Europe. Although Austria, it is not clear what else will happen. They have elections there in the fall. And the far right is now in a leading position that is against sanctions against Russia. But the current governments of Austria are talking about gradually abandoning Russian gas. Let's see how they do it. But in general, for Putin, transit through Ukraine is the shortest way to this cluster, which is now mainly bought from him by Hungary, Slovakia, Austria. Otherwise, we will have to pull through Turkey. It is more expensive. Turkey will, of course, bargain for some of its own mediation conditions. Therefore, of course, Putin and Gazprom would like to preserve Ukrainian transit.
And when will Europe abandon Russian gas?
Yes, it's about time. I do not know. They are already talking a lot about phasing out until 2027. But there is no specific plan on this topic. Although the 14th European package of sanctions, adopted in June, introduced some restrictions on Russian liquefied gas transshipment at European terminals, as well as new projects such as the Arctic and LNG 2. This is already a sign that the situation was moving forward somehow. I have high hopes for the new composition of the European Commission. I hope that he will work as soon as possible, quite vigorously. Well, you know that the new head of the European Foreign Ministry will be Kaja Kallas. It has such an unwavering position on sanctions, and I hope that all this will be resolved sooner. However, in the fall, they will need to develop a specific plan for abandoning Russian gas with the establishment of deadlines, quotas and other measures.
Vladimir, thank you very much for our conversation, for joining the broadcast and, as always, very clearly explaining to us all the difficult issues, and we are grateful that you find time for the broadcast. Let me remind you that Volodymyr Mylov was in touch with us.